Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Shubhodaya and good morning to everyone. Welcome to yet another session of Weekend with Wisdom. This is Nitin Sridhar, Chief Curator of Advaita Academy. And today we have a very special guest, Manjushree Hegde, Kumari Manjushree Hegde, I should say. And she is she has just started with her PhD in IIT Madras, and she is a very young scholar, very wonderful scholar, someone who I personally admire a lot. She currently serves as assistant professor at Amrita Darshanam in Coimbatore, Amrita Vishwavidyapeetham. Her primary area of specialization is in Vyakarana and Advaita Vedanta, which she has studied in a traditional manner under Dr. Pushpa Dikshit and Sri Ashwatha Narayana Avadhani, respectively. A very warm welcome to you, Manjushree. Thank you for coming on our platform. We are very glad to have you. Viewers, just to remind you, you should leave your questions on the question and answer box, and Manjushree ji will take it up at the end of the session, towards the end of the session. So with this very short opening remarks, I open the floor, the E-floor, I should say, and please start your session.
Thank you so much, Nitin, for the invitation, the introduction, and a very special thanks for all the viewers who are tuned in as well. I don't quite know what you expect out of this session because, in all honesty, I'm no scholar or no sadhaka, just a student. This is not modesty or false modesty. It's a genuine fear that I will let you down. I have chosen a very vast topic, the God and the origin of the world in Hindu philosophy. So what you can expect is rather dry, boring, academic exploration of the topic. I don't know if this is what you want, but this is all that I am capable of. I'm just putting it out there as just to keep the expectations in proportion to what I have to offer, that's all. Let me share my screen with you. Then we can start the session. Hindu philosophy, or rather Indian philosophy, is so rich and variegated, a multifaceted tapestry marked by disagreement, diversity. It cannot be identified with any one of its strands. So any simplification is an oversimplification. There must be at least 50 different schools of thought. The Sayana Madhaviya Sarvadarshana Sangraha chronicles 16 schools of thought, 16 different schools of thought. It is, of course, not possible to look into all of them in the short time that we have. So here I will be limiting myself to the commonly accepted Shad Darshanas. I chose this topic just to give an overview, a broad idea of the spectrum of thought that was available in India. Because today it is easy to think that Vedanta, or Advaita Vedanta in particular, was the single overarching thought that dominated all of Indian life and knowledge systems. This is rather superficial and ultimately not true. So I thought it would be interesting just to explore this topic together. Again, I want to reiterate that I am no expert of all the 6 darshanas. My knowledge is limited, and given the limited time, I will be generalizing, making blanket statements. While they will not be untrue, this I will assure you of, but they will not be nuanced. With that disclaimer, I think we can start. Just a second. The Shad Darshanas, the 6 darshanas. The term darshana used in the Indian tradition for philosophy is a rough approximation, and it lends itself to a variety of meanings. It is derived from the Sanskrit root, drishir prekshana, means to see. or a way of seeing. It means both vision and also the instrument of vision. So it is in the second sense of the term, instrument of vision, that darshana came to connote standpoint or perspective or a point of view, school of thought or philosophy. See, the use of the term darshana to denote a school of thought does not occur until the 5th century of the Common Era, where it was used by the Buddhist scholar Bhava Viveka in his Madhyamaka Hridayakarika. Madhyamaka Hridayakarika is the earliest doxographical work that is available to us. FYI, doxography is primarily or superficially a summary of competing views, a list of the prevalent viewpoints, or a systematic classification of views. Your Sarva Darshana Sangraha, the Shad Darshana Samuchaya, Shad Darshana Nirnaya, Shad Darshani Siddhanta Sangraha, Sarva Darshana Kaumudi, all of these are called as doxographies, a list of the different viewpoints. So it is perhaps Bhava Viveka, the Buddhist scholar, who used this word darshana for the first time to denote school of thought. Before that, there were other Sanskrit terms used to refer to the different philosophical systems. For example, in Shankaracharya's works, there are words like Tantra, Siddhanta, Shastra, Paksha, Mata, Samaya, Vada, etc. Okay? But mostly, after Bhava Viveka, this connotation of the word darshana becomes popular and is used frequently in this sense. Shad Darshana. See, Shad Darshana was not a static concept. In different doxographies, we find different sets of Shad Darshanas. Bhava Viveka, for example, in his work, discusses Shad Darshanas, but his Shad Darshana includes Hinayana, Yogachara, Vaisheshika, Sankhya, Vedanta, and Mimamsa in this order. This is apart from his own school, Madhyamaka. The Tamil Mani Mekhalai, it has another set of Shad Darshana, Lokayata or Charvaka, Buddhism, Sankhya, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, and Mimamsa. The Jain scholar Haribhadra Suri wrote Shad Darshana Samuchaya at the end of 8th century CE. His Shad Darshana included Buddhism, Nyaya, Sankhya, Jaina, Vaisheshika, and Mimamsa. Jayanta Bhatta's Nyaya Manjari lists Charvaka, Buddhism, Jainism, Nyaya, Sankhya, and Mimamsa. So many other lists. Merutunga, Shad Darshana Nirnaya, Sarva Siddhanta Praveshaka. One doxography called Sarva Siddhanta Sangraha excludes Nyaya and lists Mahabharata as one of the systems. So the list was very fluid and not static, not frozen. Okay. And interestingly, in many of these lists, Shad Darshana included both Astika and Nastika views. In fact, the very strict category of Astika, Nastika that we know now is a later phenomenon. The Jain doxographer Haribhadra, for example, lists Jainism and Buddhism as Astika schools. And Kumarila Bhatta regards Sankhya and Yoga as Nastika traditions. So we don't really know when this list of the Shad Darshanas, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Sankhya, Yoga, Purva, and Uttara Mimamsa, this list, we don't know exactly when this list became concrete. Professor Andrew Nicholson, he argues that it was between the 12th and the 16th century CE that certain thinkers, Vijnana Bhikshu in particular, began to treat as a single whole the diverse philosophical teachings of these schools, and they came to be known retrospectively as the 6 systems, Shad Darshana, of mainstream Hindu philosophy that is popular now. So in the pre-12th century India, there was no understanding that all of these thinkers were a part of a shared orthodoxy. Nor was there an idea that schools such as Sankhya and Mimamsa had any commonalities that differentiated them from the Jainas and Buddhists. Kumarila Bhatta, he writes, Sankhya, Yoga, Pancharatra, Pashupata, and Buddhist works are not accepted by those who know the Veda. Yani etani traividbhirna parigrihitani. Sankhya Yoga Pancharatra Pashupata Sakhya Grantha Parigrihita Dharma Dharma Nipathanani. Likewise, Sankhya and Yoga philosophers, they faulted Vedantins and Mimamsakas for their uncritical acceptance of Vedic authority, which included the performance of what they considered immoral animal sacrifices. So, Somashambhu, he writes, Vedantins, Mimamsakas, and all those who worship other gods, such as Vishnu, will be reborn in hell. Just as an aside, I want to tell you this. Of course, everybody knows that the Indian intellectual tradition is a stock of debates and arguments, and all the classical Indian texts contain within their pages elaborate expositions and discussions among the different schools of thought. But what you probably don't know is that these debates, they're not always boringly civil. No, war constantly brewed on the pages of Indian philosophy. I'll give you an example. Appaya Dikshita, the brilliant Advaita thinker from 16th century, he had several problems with the Dvaita Vedanta of Madhvacharya. So, of course, he wrote a book on it. He titled it Madhva Tantra Mukhamardana, clobbering the face of Madhva's philosophy. Now, the Dvaitins are not going to suffer this insult in silence. Vijayendra Tirtha came along and wrote a scathing critique of Appaya's work, titled it Appaya Kapola Chapetika, a slap on the cheek of Appaya. Now, Trivikrama Pandita, an Advaita scholar who lost to Madhvacharya in a debate and became Advaitin, he wrote a long treatise claiming that Shankaracharya is actually the reincarnation of a demon from the Mahabharata. Okay. In reply to this, a modern Advaita scholar, he amassed scriptural evidence to establish that it was, in fact, Madhvacharya who was the demon, not Shankaracharya. And in reply to that, a contemporary Advaita scholar wrote another book, but you get the drift. Debates were not always gentlemanly. They could be like street fights. They could be like bar brawls. They could be like Saas Bahu Tutu Meme, very entertaining if nothing else. But coming back to the topic at hand, this demarcation, this boundary between the Astikas and Nastikas did not exist before the late medieval period. Of course, the later codifiers, the later toxographers did depict the Shad Darshanas as sharing a fundamental commitment to the authority of the Veda that unified them as Hindus and made them understand themselves as fundamentally different from the Jainas and Buddhists. But this is a very late phenomenon. So there are a lot of misconceptions and uncritical generalizations in the public domain. There's a certain picture of
Sorry to interrupt, Manjushree. I think your presentation, is it deliberately single cell or it is appears to be stuck in first slide?
No, I'm still there. It's just an introduction.
Okay, fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to say that there is a lot of misconceptions and uncritical generalizations in the public domain. There's a certain picture of India's philosophical past, which has become fixed in the minds of the public. And this is part of the reason why I chose to speak on this topic. In fact, there's a very interesting paper by Daya Krishna called 3 Myths About Indian Philosophy, in which he raises questions against 3 ideas about Indian philosophy that are so popularly accepted, that seem so self-evident that to question them seems to, or is to question the very concept of Indian philosophy as it has been popularly conceived. First, he raises a question against the idea that Hindu philosophy is spiritual. Now, who does not think that Hindu philosophy is spiritual in character? We have been told repeatedly that this is what specifically distinguishes it from the Western philosophy and makes it something unique and apart from all the other philosophical traditions of the world. Because our philosophy is spiritual. But what does it mean to say this? What exactly is meant by describing a whole philosophical tradition as spiritual? See, spiritual means you assert the primacy of consciousness as opposed to the inertness associated with objects that are purely material in their nature. Spirit is opposed to matter, and spiritual or spiritualist metaphysics implies that spirit alone is real, that consciousness alone is real, and what appears as matter is only an appearance, unreal. Now, from this perspective, Hindu philosophy can hardly be characterized as spiritual in character. Yes, most of the schools of Hindu philosophy recognize the ultimate reality of consciousness in some form or other, but they also recognize the ultimate reality of matter in some form or other. The Vaisheshikas and Sankhyas recognize it openly. Nayayikas certainly believe in the reality of the Atman, but they deny the essential characteristic of consciousness. For the Nayayikas, consciousness is not an inalienable quality of the Atman. No. Consciousness arises in it when it comes into contact with the mind. Similarly, Vedanta also. Vedanta is not only Shankara Vedanta. There are Dvaitis such as Madhva who regard matter or Prakriti as an eternal independent principle in its own right. Ramanuja also believes in the ultimate distinction in nature of matter from God. So matter is not unreal for all Vedantis also. So it isn't entirely correct to say Hindu or Indian philosophy is spiritual in nature and Western philosophy in contrast to it is materialist. It isn't entirely correct to say this. Daya Krishna raises another important question against the uniform acceptance of the authority of the Vedas in the Astika traditions. See, popularly, the different schools of thought are classified into orthodox Astika and unorthodox Nastika schools in terms of their acceptance or non-acceptance of the authority of the Vedas, correct? If they accept the authority of the Vedas, they are Astika. If they don't accept the authority of the Vedas, they are called as Nastika. But what exactly is meant by this? Does it mean to say that the Shad Darshanas uniformly accept that the Vedas contain the ultimate philosophical truth? And that the test of the truth of a philosophical position is whether or not it is in accordance with what is written in the Vedas? No. The very second Karika of Ishvara Krishna's Sankhya Karika states, Drishtavad anushravikaha sahyavishuddhi krayatishaya yuktaha tad viparitaha shreyan yakta viktadnya vijnanat. Vedas, like perception, like pratyaksha, is ineffective in relieving suffering because it is avishuddhi kshaya atishaya yuktaha. It is associated with impurity, destruction, and excess. So the best means is the one that is opposite to these two, tad viparitaha. For Ishvara Krishna, Anumana is the preferred method since of the three, Pratyaksha, Anumana, and Veda, he considers Anumana to be pure and free from Kshaya and Atishaya. So the six systems don't uniformly accept the absolute authority of the Vedas. If this was really the case, then the differences between the Shad Darshanas would arise because of their varying interpretations of what the Vedas really meant. But is this really so? Is it true to say that Sankhya or Yoga or Nyaya or Vaisheshika differ regarding the exact meaning of the Vedic texts? Are they schools of interpretation which clash over what the Vedas really mean? No, not at all. They are not in any form a commentary on the Vedas. Mimamsa and Vedanta can legitimately be called as commentary on the Vedas. But these two schools don't agree on what the Vedas are. They have a difference of opinion regarding which portion of the Vedas is supposed to be authoritative. They have a difference of opinion regarding what the subject matter of the Vedas is. they have a difference of opinion regarding what the purpose of the Vedas is. The Mimamsakas don't count the Upanishads as part of the corpus of Vedic authority. They contend that any utterance which is not a pure injunction, that is a command or a prohibition, vidhi or nishedha. Any utterance that is not vidhi or nishedha is not Veda. So for them, the Vedas have no philosophic content whatsoever. For them, Vedas are pure injunctions. Svarga kamo yajeta. This is Veda. Aham brahmasmi is not Veda for them. So you see the range of opinions, the number of divergent viewpoints that are available that make up Hindu philosophy. There are a lot of generalizations, very uncritical, unexamined ideas that are popular in the public domain. So in these two sessions, I'd like to give a broad overview of each of the systems and what they bring to the table. I did debate in my head as to how I want to present this. Do I want to do Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Sankhya, Yoga? Or do I want to take up a topic like Atman or God and then see what each system has to say about this particular topic? But in the end, I decided to go with an elaboration of each of the systems separately, because that is probably the only way you will be able to appreciate and get a clearer idea of what each of the system is. So with that as an introduction, we can start with the actual session. I'd like to begin with Nyaya and Vaisheshika. I'll do Nyaya, Vaisheshika, and hopefully Sankhya, and then the other systems tomorrow. Just give me one moment. The Nyaya and Vaisheshika systems. There are two systems of Indian philosophy. In their early histories, Nyaya and Vaisheshika were two independent systems with their own respective metaphysics, epistemology, logic, ethics, soteriology. Over time, the Vaisheshika system became so entwined with the Nyaya that until recently, there was almost no independent study of the Vaisheshika as a basic system. The traditional textbooks treat both systems as one. They consider themselves as mutually supportive, Nyaya specializing in epistemology and methodology, Vaisheshika in metaphysics. Professor M. Hiriyana says that maybe a formal synthesis of the two systems occurred around the 10th century. Prior to that, they functioned rather independently of each other. But be that as it may, I'll give a very broad overview of both the systems. Now, the oldest text of Nyaya Shastra is Akshapada Gautama's Nyaya Sutras, dated to perhaps the 2nd or 3rd century CE. The oldest text of Vaisheshika is Kanada's Vaisheshika Sutras or Kanada Sutras, which may have been composed around 200 BC. See, most of you know this, but just for your information, the different schools of thought, the different systems of philosophy are built around the sutras. The sutras are like formulas, very short formulas. The very famous definition, Alpaksharam, Asandigdham. Of course, the sutras are not always Asandigdham. In many texts, without the bhashya, it is impossible to ascertain what the sutras mean, because they are very short and pregnant half sentences. They don't elaborate the subject in detail. They were probably meant for someone who was already thoroughly acquainted with the subject, so they could serve as threads of memory. So sort of like lecture hints intended for those who had direct, elaborate oral instructions on the subject. But generally, sutras are very short, pithy assertions, statements, laying down something in a scientific treatise. Every system of Indian philosophy, or at least many of them, have the sutras as a starting point. Nyaya has Nyaya Sutras written by Akshapada Gautama. Vaisheshika has Vaisheshika Sutras written by Kanada. Mimamsa has Jaimini Sutras, Vedanta has Brahma Sutras, Yoga has Yoga Sutras, Sankhya Karikas for Sankhya, Panini Sutras for Vyakarana. So the sutras are sort of the core. around which the entire system builds and expands. It builds and expands by commenting on these sutras, by interpreting these sutras. Because the sutras are very brief, they are formulas. So the meanings of these formulas have to be unpacked. Till today, the entire Vyakarana Shastra, which is a huge corpus built over centuries, this entire long tradition is primarily an attempt to make sense of Panini Sutras. You remove that, everything will fall apart. Of course, not all the disciplines function like this. Over the centuries, the debates and discussions in the different systems have evolved outside of the framework provided by the sutras, but still, the sutras function as a sort of starting point, if nothing else. So Nyaya Shastra has for its starting point Akshapada Gautama's Nyaya Sutras, and for Vaisheshika there is Kanada's Vaisheshika Sutras. Very little is known about both the authors. Akshapada is believed to mean he who has his eye fixed in abstraction on his feet. It could mean Aksham Netram Darshana Sadhanataya Jataha Padosya. It could also mean being rooted in the senses of perception. There's an interesting story. Akshapado hi swamata dushakasya vyasasya mukha darshanam chakshusha na kartavyam iti pratijnaya paschad vyasena prasaditaha tade netram prakashya tam drishtavan iti prasiddhi. There are similar legends associated with Kanada also. Another name of Kanada is Uluka, owl. Okay, in the Jaina tradition, Kanada is described as Shaduluka, one who propounded the doctrine of 6 categories. The Sarvadarshana Sangraha calls Vaisheshika system as Aulukya. An interesting anecdote tells us that Kanada took the form of an owl to please Lord Shiva. According to another account in the Kanada Rahasya, Lord Shiva took the form of an owl and instructed Kanada in the system of Vaisheshika. Kanada itself is a strange but quite interesting name. It means Kanan Ati, eater of grains. Kana is also atom, so atom eater, because he propounded the theory that the world is formed by an aggregation of atoms. Kana could also mean little. So Kanada, he who eats little, so referring to the abstemiousness of Kanada, of the saint. Be that as it may, the two systems of Nyaya and Vaisheshika are fascinating as objects of study. Both systems have multiple facets that have contributed immensely to the dialogues and debates within the Indian knowledge systems. But we have limited time on our hands, so I want to focus only on the philosophy put forth by these systems. See, in order to qualify as a school of philosophy, 5 questions must be addressed. 5 questions have to be addressed. 1. What is the nature of Jiva or self? 2. What is the nature of Jagat or the world that we see? 3. What is the nature of Ishvara or God, if such a category is allowed in the system? 4. Why is there suffering? Or rather, what is the cause of bandha? And 5. What is the way out of suffering? What is the method of moksha? These 5 questions must be answered for a system to qualify as a school of philosophy. So I'm going to look into how these two systems of Nyaya and Vaisheshika have answered these 5 questions. Because outside of these questions, the Nyaya school has contributed immensely to logic and dialect. And Kannada's system is the closest approximation to what we understand as physics today. Professor Subhash Kak has written a very nice book on this, where he has compared Kannada's laws of Vaisheshika physics to the corresponding laws of classical physics. Many ideas of modern understandings of the world have been anticipated in this work. But unfortunately, I have to sidestep all of that. I have to limit myself to what I can talk about in an hour to give you a comprehensive view of the two systems. So I will limit myself only to the philosophy and will not venture outside of it. But if you are interested, if you have the time, you must look into those aspects also, because they're very fascinating in themselves. With that, I think we can start. See, right at the outset of the Vaisheshika Sutras, the very first sutra, Kanada Maharshi states, Athato dharma vyakhyāsyāmaha. Athato dharmam vyakhyāsyāmaha. Now we will explain dharma. This is the first sutra of Kanada's Vaisheshika Sutras. See, this is also the usual style in which the sutras begin. Brahma Sutras begins with Athato Brahma Jijnasa. Jaimini Sutras begin with Athato Dharma Jijnasa. Yoga Sutras start with Atha Yoganushasanam. So in the very first sutra, the subject matter is very clearly stated. Athato Dharmam Vyakhyāsyāmaha. Now we will explain dharma. The second sutra states, Yataha Abhyudaya Nishreyasa Siddhihi Sadharmaha. That is dharma which leads to the attainment of Abhyudaya, to material wealth, and Nishreyasa, to the ultimate happiness. Dharma is that which leads to prosperity in this world and the other. This is Kanada Maharshi's definition of dharma. Dharma is that which leads to Abhyudaya and Nishreyasa. See, in the next sutra, in the fourth sutra, he makes a list of 6 padarthas and states that the true knowledge of these 6 padarthas will lead to Nishreyasa. Padartha is Padasya Arthaha. Pada is words, the words that we use in ordinary language. The words that we use, it refers to something, to some object that is part of this world. Every word that we use refers to something. Now, Kanada Maharshi declares that there are 6 padarthas, rather 6 basic types of objects, which means that anything that we can possibly refer to must fall into one of the 6 basic types. Literally, every object of this world can be put into one of the 6 categories. This is very ambitious. You are stating that there are 6 boxes into which everything of this world, anything that you can refer to, anything that you can talk about, can be put into, or rather belongs to one of these 6 boxes, 6 categories. There is nothing that is outside of these 6 boxes. Everything can be put into one of these 6 boxes. This is very ambitious. The 6 types of objects are Dravya, Guna, Karma, Samanya, Vishesha, and Samavaya. He says, Dharma Vishesha Prasutad, Dravya Guna Karma Samanya Vishesha Samavayanam Padarthanam, Sadharmya Vaidharmyabhyam Tattvajnana Nishreyasam. See, of course, these 6 basic types of objects include detailed subcategorization. Dravya is divided into 9 types. Guna is divided into 24 types. Karma is of 5 types. Samanya is divided into 3 types. Vishesha, being unique particulars, do not have internal differentiation. Samavaya, a relation par excellence, is also without any internal distinction. Please note that each of these terms is a very technical term, very specific to this system. You cannot take one definition from one discipline and use it in another. For example, Dravya is not matter. It is not substance within the Nyaya Vaisheshika. Within the Nyaya Vaisheshika, Dravya has a very technical connotation. It means substratum. the ground which has the capacity to be an ashraya for guna and karma. It's a very subtle concept. Similarly, guna in Sankhya will refer to the three gunas of sattva, rajas, and tamas. In Vyakarana, guna is Adeng Gunaha, the three letters A, and O. These three letters are called as guna in Vyakarana. This is why you have guna sandhi. In Nyaya Vaisheshika, gunas refer to 24 different qualities. Again, quality is not exactly how we ordinarily understand it. I'll come to this in a while. Kanada states that the true knowledge of these six padarthas, these six types of objects, will lead to Nishreyasa. If you correctly understand the six types of objects, how they are similar, how they are different, this knowledge will lead to Nishreyasa. His sutra is Dharma Vishesha Prasutat, Dravya Guna Karma Samanya Vishesha Samavayanam Padarthanam Sadharmya Vaidharmyabhyam Tattvajnana Nishreyasa. Now, Gautama, in his Nyaya Sutras, in the first sutra, states something very similar. Pramana Prameya Samshaya Prayojana Drishtanta Siddhantavayava Tarka Nirnaya Vada Jalpa Vitanda Hetva Bhasa Chala Jati Nigrahasthananam Tattvajnanat Nishreyasaki Kamaha. This is the first sutra of the Nyaya Sutras. This is a list of 16 padarthas. Kanada's list has 6 padarthas. Gautama's has 16. Note that he has not technically called them padarthas. He has simply given a list of 16 terms and stated that the right knowledge about these 16 terms will lead to Nishreyasa. The 16 objects are Pramana, Prameya, Samshaya, Prayojana, Drishtanta, Siddhanta, Avayava, Tarka, Nirnaya, Vada, Jalpa, Vitanda, Hetvabhasa, Chala, Jati, and Nigrahasthana. At first sight, this looks like a very odd list. See, the fundamental difference between Gautama's list and Kanada's list is that Gautama is not stating that there are 16 and only 16 basic types of objects in the world. No, this is not what he's saying. Rather, his only suggestion is that these 16 terms are important as the key terms in philosophy and the methodology of philosophy. So the terms included in Gautama's list belong to the methodology of philosophy, which centers around 2 concepts called pramana and vada. Roughly speaking, these refer to logic and dialect. Okay. See, earlier, Nyaya was apparently only the science of methodology. It did not have its own metaphysics or physics, but it could be used by theoreticians for doing either physics or metaphysics. It's a methodology. This is the image of Nyaya, which we gather from earlier sources like Charaka Samhita. But by introducing Prameya, the second object in the list of 16, Prameya is the second object. By introducing this, Gautama gave Nyaya its identity as a philosophical school. That is, identity as a philosophy of Apavarga, Nishreyasa. So Gautama's list can be divided into 2 parts: subject matter of philosophy and methodology of philosophy. Prameya, the second object on the list, only Prameya is the proper subject matter of philosophy. All the other 15 objects on the list, they constitute the methodology of philosophy. Prameya, the subject matter of philosophy, this Gautama further divides into 12. He says there are 12 things that can be considered as subject matter of philosophy. This list of 12 includes self, body, sense organs, objects of senses, cognition, mind, activity, fault, life after death, fruits of action, misery, emancipation, atma sharirendriyartha buddhi mana pravritti, dosha pretya bhava, phala dukkhapavargastu prameyam. This is his sutra. Atma sharira indriyartha buddhi mana pravritti dosha pretya bhava, phala dukkhapavargastu prameyam. Again, this list is not like Kanada's. It is not listing the objects of the world. These are the important factors of human life. See, the Vaisheshikas were interested in finding out and analyzing the factors of the objective world. And they were looking at the subjective world, so to speak, as a small part of that objective world, not always as its center. But Gautama seems to support that the basic facts of human life, for example, that we have a body, that we sense certain objects, we act, we experience pain, we are capable of apavarga. These form the real problems of philosophy. See, the word prameya can be interpreted in two ways. Okay, one, that which is possible to know, and two, that which ought to be known. So the Vaisheshika Padarthas, in a way, are prameya because they can be known by us, that which is possible to know. Gautama follows the second meaning of prameya, that which ought to be known. For Kanada, knowledge of the six Padarthas would lead to abhyudaya, prosperous worldly life, as well as nishreyasa, apavarga. Kanada was viewing the Padarthas as the constituents of the objective world. So a deeper understanding of the constituents of the world would help us in living a prosperous worldly life on the one hand. And on the other hand, it will also allow us to recognize its essential nature as anatma and therefore detach ourselves from it. Kanada thus emphasized the abhyudaya aspect along with nishreyasa. Gautama seems to have emphasized only the latter. So what did nishreyasa mean for Kanada and Gautama? See, commenting on the very first sutra of Gautama's Nyaya Sutra, Vatsyayana, the Bhashyakara, he writes, Nishreyasadhikamopavarga praptihi. Nishreyasa, the attainment of the highest good, is nothing but apavarga praptihi. That is liberation. Nishreyasa is liberation. But again, what exactly is liberation according to Nyaya? Who is to be liberated and from what? Let's look into that. See, for the Nayayikas, for the Prachina Nayayikas, I have to make a distinction every time. Please remember that I'm talking only about Prachina Nyaya. For the Prachina Nayayikas, Atma is a prameya. Atma is something which ought to be known. Gautama, in the very 10th sutra, he states, Ichha dvesha prayatma sukha dukkha jnanani atmanaha lingam iti. Ichha, dvesha, see, ichha is desire. Dvesha, aversion. Prayatna, volition. Sukha, pleasure. Dukkha, pain, and jnana, knowledge, also cognition. These are Atma's linga indicatives, the indicatives of the self. The self can be inferred with the help of desire, aversion, etc. See, if you desire an object that you see now, this desire is possible only because you have perceived this same object on an earlier occasion and have experienced pleasure by coming into contact with it. Desire would not be possible if there wasn't a single agent that cognized and recognized the object. It must be the same agent which experienced pleasure earlier, remembers that experience, and therefore experiences desire now. This single agent which experienced pleasure now recognizes the object and experiences desire. This is the self. So the self is inferred by the Nayayikas through the indicators Ichha, Dvesha, Prayatna, Sukha, Dukkha, and Jnana. Also Dharma, Adharma, and Bhavana or Samskara. So the self is the Ashraya that is capable of synthesizing past and present experiences. Purva Pararasandhana Samartha. The claim then is that desire can be accounted for only by accepting that the owner of the past and present experiences is the same, samana kartrika, because na anya drashtaha arthaha smartum anyena shakyate. A thing experienced by one cannot be remembered by another. Udyotakara states in his work, yasmat etes vrityasaha eka vishaya bhavanti tasmat eka kartrikatvam pratipadayam. Nahi nana kartrikanam, nana vishayanam, nana nimittanam cha pratyayanam pratisandhanam asti. This is the same type of argument that is used within the Nyaya theory of karma. If I am rightly made accountable for my own past actions, then the person who receives the karmic fruits of the actions must be the same person who performed those actions. Surely this implies that the kartru of the original act and the bhoktru of the karma phala is the same self. This is how the Nayayikas use anumana, inference, to infer that there is Atma. Okay, it is not known by Pratyaksha, it is not known by other sources. It is Anumana that Nayayika falls back to in order to understand what the Atman is. So the self, Atman, is the substratum of Ichha, Dvesha, etc. See, Ichha, Dvesha, Prayatna, all of them are gunas, qualities. In the system of Nyaya, qualities cannot exist on their own. They cannot float around like ontological balloons. They require a substratum. If there's a red apple, the red color is a quality. It cannot exist on its own. It requires a substance to reside in. So desire, etc. are qualities. They require a substratum. They are supported by a substance, a dravya. The dravya, which is the support of these qualities, is the self. It is the substratum, the ashraya for these qualities. Ichha, dvesha, prayatna, sukha, dukkha, jnana, etc. This self for Gautama is innumerable. Nyaya and Vaisheshika both argue for plurality of self. Prashastapada, for example, argues that there must be many selves, since it is evident that the qualities of one do not produce qualities of others. Only I can be the locus of my pain. Only I can know directly my internal states of body and mind. I cannot know yours. So therefore, there are as many selves as there are individuals. Further, this self is all-pervasive. Vyoma Shiva argues that only such a hypothesis can explain a yogi's ability to inhabit many bodies simultaneously. So each individual self is all-pervasive according to Nyaya Vaisheshika. What distinguishes one self from the other is its karma, the karmic merit. In the absence of a distinguishing property like karmic merit, the individual selves would equally be connected to each and every body. Or rather, many selves would share a single body, but that is not the case. Each self's karma ties it to a particular body. Then, this self is eternal. It cannot be produced or destroyed. The Nayayikas furnish very peculiar arguments. The Nayayikas argues like this. A newborn infant experiences joy, fear, sorrow. He has the desire for the milk from his mother's breast. The experiences of joy, fear, and sorrow are indicated by the infant's smiles and cries, and the desire for milk is indicated by its groping for the mother's breast. Udyotakara explains that this leads to the inference of remembrance of the past. Remembrance leads to the inference of impressions. The impressions to that of previous cognition, and that cognition leads to the inference of the existence of a previous body. And on the basis of this argument, the Nayayika claims that the infant had a body previous to this one, and that the infant's self departed the previous body at death and has now become endowed with the new body at this birth. This is how the Nayayika argues that the self is eternal. You understand why inference, or rather the pramana theory, had to be developed so extensively within the Nyaya system, because literally this is the tool that they will employ to establish all their siddhantas. So a lot of Navya Nyaya is completely focused on fine-tuning this very sophisticated tool of inference, which can be used to be establishing all of this, but you get an idea of that. Then, Chaitanya. See, it is commonly held that a distinguishing characteristic of the self is its consciousness. Well-worn metaphors compare the self to light as its awareness illumines the world of noble objects. But in Nyaya, consciousness, cognition is a quality, a guna that adheres to the self, but it is not an essential quality of the self. The self exists without consciousness. It is capable of having consciousness under suitable conditions. Consciousness arises in a self when the appropriate causal conditions are present, when the self comes in contact with the mind and the body. But by itself, it is not conscious. It is just that the self alone is capable of having consciousness. So the self finally is innumerable. Each individual self is an all-pervasive, eternal dravya in Nyaya Vaisheshika. Remember that dravya is a very technical term in Nyaya Vaisheshika. It does not simply mean material like stone, paper, etc. It refers to substratum that can be the ashraya of guna and karma, of quality and action. Kanada Maharshi's definition of Atman is also very similar. He writes, Pranapana nimishonmesha jivana manogati indriyantara vikaraha sukhadukhecha dveshau prayatnascheti atmalingani. The indicators of the self are prana and apana. Closing and opening of the eyes, the vital and mental motions, alteration of some sense with another sense, pleasure, pain, desire, aversion, effort. These are the indicators of the self. Tasya gunaha buddhi sukha dukhecha dvesha prayatnadrishta samskara vaisheshikaha. The peculiar qualities of the self are cognition, pleasure, pain, desire, aversion, effort, adrishta is merit and demerit, and samskara. These are the peculiar qualities of the self. There's a slight difference of opinion here. The Vaisheshika opine that on the one side, the mind is the actual substratum of cognition, and on the other side, the self is the actual substratum of pleasure, pain, etc. For the Nayayikas, the self is the actual experiencer of cognition, desire, aversion, etc. Which means that self is not only what experiences the various feelings and desires, but it is also the actual knower of them. So the self is capable of both knowing and feeling. On the contrary, for the Vaisheshika, the mind was the substratum of cognition, self is the substratum of desire, etc. So slight difference of opinion in the early stages, but they sort of find a middle ground soon enough. Now this self is to be liberated. According to the Nayayikas, the unliberated life is characterized by mithya jnana. This sounds very similar to Advaitic thought, but the difference is that in the Nyaya worldview, the world is eternally existing. even if they believe in cycles of creation. So the world exists just the way it appears. What you see is what you get. Mithya Jnana is not exactly like that of the Advaita. Okay? See, for the Nayayika, Mithya Jnana is of two types. Two defective judgments about the nature of reality. One, that the self is a psychophysical complex. The other, that the objects are worthy of attachment. This is the Mithya Jnana. Gautama writes, Dosha nimittanam tattvajnanat ahankara nivrittihi. Dosha nimittam rupadayo vishayaha sankalpa kritaha. Through correct cognition, there is cessation of ahankara. For the Nayayika, the I aspect or egoity is the result of mithya jnana. So this is Vatsyayana's Bhashya. He writes, Kim punasta mithya jnana? What then is this erroneous cognition? What is mithya jnana? Anatmanyatma graha. It is mistakenly to grasp what is not the self as the self. Aham asmiti moho ahankara iti. I am is the delusion of the ahankara. Anatmanam khalvaham asmi iti pashyato drishtir ahankara iti. When what is not the self is seen as what I truly am, that is called as ahankara. Kim punastadarthadatam yad vishayo ahankaraha. What then is the collection of things which form the content of egoity? Sharirendriya manovedana buddhayaha. The body, the senses, the mind, feelings and intellect. This is the content of ahankara. Katham tad vishayo ahankara samsara bijam bhavati. How does the content of egoity become the seed of samsara, of transmigration? Ayam khalu shariraadyarthadatam ahamasmiti vyavasitaha tad uchchedena atmochedam manyamano anuchcheda trishna pariputaha punah punastat upadatte tad upadadanu janma maranaya yadate tena viyoga natyantam dukkha vimuchyata iti yastu dukkham dukkhayatanam dukkhanushaktam sukhancha sarvam idam dukkham iti pashyati sa dukkham parijanati parijnatancha dukkham prahinam bhavatyanuparana savisham navat. See, when you decide that I am the body together with these other things, you think that their destruction to be the destruction of the self. They're overwhelmed by the desire that they not be destroyed, and so repeatedly acquire them. With such acquisition, your efforts only bring you repeated birth and death. So never being separated from them, you're never totally freed from suffering. The person who sees that suffering, the abode of suffering, that is the body, and happiness also as suffering, then you comprehend the nature of suffering. And with this comprehension, the suffering is done away with. It is not taken like poison food. See, ahankara is the ascription of I-ness to the body, mind, intellect, feelings, etc. When these are assumed to be the self wants the body-mind complex to persist, desires that they not be destroyed. The self acts through and with these elements, and as a consequence, bears the fruits of its actions. And action entails repeated embodiment. Further lives are required. This is the cycle of birth and death, samsara. So long as there is identity with the body-mind complex, there is desire and accumulation of karma and birth and death. So it is this identity that must be dissolved. So liberation, according to Nyaya, is the dissolution of the bond between the real self and the real world. Because the body-mind complex is very real as the self itself. So the world will stay as it is. The bond between the self and the world dissolves. In his very second sutra, Gautama says, Dukkha janma pravritti dosha mithya jnananam uttarottarapaye tadantarapaye apavargaha. Dukkha janma pravritti dosha and mithya jnana. The primary cause of dukkha is mithya jnana, which leads to pravritti dosha, nothing but raga and dvesha, or rather desire, which in turn leads to janma and consequently to dukkha. So the cessation of mithya jnana will lead to the cessation of desire and therefore of rebirth and therefore of dukkha. Ultimately, the cessation of dukkha is apavarga. This is Gautama's definition. Liberation for the Nayayika is the absolute cessation of pain. Atyantika dukkha vimukti. Here, dukkha is defined as badhana lakshanam dukkham, badhana pida, tapa iti. See, the Nayayikas consider birth itself as dukkha. They treat all aspects of embodied existence as pain. In order to avoid pain, in order to avoid dukkha, we must seek mukti from all pain involved in embodied existence. Not because they are literally pain, but because they are inextricably connected to pain. He says, Tayanuviddham anushaktam avinirbhagena vartamanam dukkha yoga dukkham iti. Soyam sarvam dukkhena iti pashyan dukkham jihasura janma dukkha darshi nirvidyate nirvanno virajyate virakto vimuchyate. Anything that is intertwined, anuviddha, and connected, anushakta, with pain is pain. He who understands this will see birth itself as pain and nirvidyate, nirvinno virajyate. He becomes detached, and he who becomes detached becomes free. Virakto vimuchyate. The argument of this passage is that when a person sees that this birth is inseparably connected to an overwhelming amount of pain, he will come to see all aspects of it as pain, because janma jayate iti sharirendriya buddhaya. Janma stands for body, senses and buddhi. Janma means it encompasses both physical and psychological aspects of our embodied existence. So when a person sees this birth as pain, he will lose attachment towards these aspects of embodied existence and will desire to be free from it. Gautama says that liberation is absolute freedom from that. Tat atyanta vimokshopa vargaha. Tena dukkhena janmana atyantam vimuktir apavargaha. Katham upatasya janmanohanam anyasya chanupadanam. Etam avastham apariyantam apavargam vedayanti apavarga vidaha. A similar account of liberation is put forward in Vaisheshika also. Liberation is the absence of the sanyoga between self and body, and is also the absence of the appearance of another body. See, what is characteristically different in this idea of moksha is that there is no concept of ananda. In fact, the Bhashyakara Vatsyayana takes great pain to refute the idea that there is ananda in the liberated state. For the Nayayikas, pleasure is a quality, a guna. It can only arise within a body. When there is pleasure, the sanyoga between the manas and the atman allows for the awareness of the pleasure. Atmamanah sanyogasya nimittantara sahitasya hetutvam. If by definition, liberation is complete detachment from the body, from embodied existence, then how can the self, Atman, experience Ananda? Vatsyayana writes, Nityam sukham atmano mahatpavan mokshe vyajyate yenabhivyaktena atyantam vimuktaha sukhi bhavati iti kechin manyante. Tesham pramana bhavat anupapattihi na pratyaksham nanumanam nagamo va vidyate nityam sukham atmano mahatvavan mokshe abhivyajyata iti. See, Vatsyayana's reasoning here uses the idea that happiness, pleasure, ananda, he doesn't differentiate between sukha and ananda. For him, these are like other experiential states and is possible only through the body. The function of the body is to render consciousness of the world through its perceptual and other instruments. So Nyaya rules out all experiences that is without body. It doesn't allow for such an experience. So this is considered as an experience. This is also something that is different, of course, but we'll come to that later. The necessity of the body for experience anchors the Nyaya theory that all cognitive states are depending on the external conditions. Okay, so therefore it is that the Nayayika does not allow for ananda in the state of moksha. Adhyayana also argues that by the very fact of ananda being desirable, it rules itself out as the content of liberation. Being desirable, it provokes attachment, and attachment is opposite to liberation. So there can be no attainment of moksha without renunciation of any attachment, even to eternal ananda, since attachment is bondage. So if holding that moksha is eternal happiness and one becomes attached to eternal happiness and strives for liberation, one would neither achieve liberation nor deserve it, is sort of what his argument is. So this is the Nyaya idea of moksha. But how to attain this moksha? See, this is what is given as the sadhana krama. Tan purvam prasanjakshita. Prasanjakshita is to meditate. Meditate on them. On what? The objects of the senses. Tanscha prasanjakshanasya rupadivishayo mithyasankalpo nivartate. For the one who reflects on them, the false sankalpa about rupa, etc. ceases. Tan nivritta adhyatm shariradi prasanjakshita. When that ceases, reflect on the body, etc. in relation to the self. Tat prasankhyanat adhyatma vishayo hankaro nivartate. From the meditative awareness, prasankhyanat, of that, the ego construction with respect to oneself ceases. Now, soyam adhyatmam bahishta vivitta chitto viharan mukta ityuchyate. Now, detached from the mind and the world outside, he is said to be free. Udyotakara says that our ordinary attachments towards our own material possessions are based on the thought that there is something special about these material possessions insofar as they belong only to us. We think these are just mine. For sadhana, you should repeat that these are not mine. Naite mama. Daiva chauragni dayadi sadharana iti. This is a method of sadhana that he proposes to tell yourself that these are not mine. They are shared, like something that may be used for worship, or something that is stolen, or fire, or something that is inherited, etc. The thought then is that by discovering the nature of objects of senses, we can get rid of some of our attachments. But in order to undermine other attachments like the desire for rebirth, we will have to meditate on the nature of the body, the senses, the manas, etc. So first you start by meditating on the nature of objects of the world, detach yourself from it, and then you start meditating on the very nature of the body, the sense, the manas, etc. So for this you require a different kind of meditative awareness, which distinguishes the self from not self. Shariradishu naite atmanam iti vyatireka darshanam prasanjakshanam. Prasankhyanam. I don't remember exactly what the shloka was. But this is the sadhana krama that is proposed by the Nyaya model. By cultivating foul labels with regard to the body, one comes to see the body really to be the foul object that it is. That is simply a mass of hair, flesh, blood, bones, ligaments, veins, etc. So Vatsyayana suggests that we should apply the label pain to all aspects of embodied existence in order to induce a motivational shift such that we first become disinterested with respect to all the realms and then lose this thirst with respect to all the realms. So in this way, we free ourselves from all pain. So he writes, Evam sarvam utpatti sthanam vividha badhananushabdam pashyataha sukhetat sadhaneshu cha sharirendriya buddhishu dukkha sanyam vyavatisthate. He who perceives pain, the basis of pain, and the fact that pleasure is also connected to pain in some form, he becomes comprehensively aware of pain. And when comprehensively apprehended, you detach yourself from it. See, again, I want to put a disclaimer that amongst the early Nayayikas, this was the conception. Udyotakara, Vachaspati Mishra, Jayanta Bhatta, Udayana, all of them expand on this very conception. Notable exception is Bhasarvanya, who defends the thesis that liberation involves an awareness of pleasure. Okay. And the later Nayayikas, Gangesha Upadhyaya, Gadadhara Bhattacharya, or they revised this conception of liberation. So I must remark again that the entire Nyaya tradition is not a monolithic block. There are so many differences of opinion within the tradition itself. And post the 10th century, with the advent of Navya Nyaya, the entire school took a whole new direction. So this must be kept in mind. Let me just touch upon the idea of Ishvara in Nyaya and Vaisheshika before we wrap this up. There are no references to Ishvara in the sutras of Kannada. Gautama also makes a very casual mention, and some have doubted whether Nyaya was originally theistic. But the Bhashyakaras, both Prashastapada and Vatsyayana, recognize Ishvara. And it is Udayana who gives what has come to be regarded as the classical exposition of the problem and the solution. There are 3 sutras in Gautama's Nyaya Sutras which discuss this. According to the Nayayikas, Ishvara is recognized and classified under Atman. He is described as Paramatman to distinguish him from the Jivatman or the individual self. So Ishvara is also a Dravya. One of the 9 Dravyas, Ishvara is also a Dravya. He is like the other Atmans, he is omnipresent and eternal. But while consciousness and related attributes do not characterize the Jivatman, they do so characterize Ishvara. His knowledge is not only eternal but also universal and perfect. He can desire and will, but unlike the Jiva, he has no pain or pleasures. He is regarded as responsible for the creation of the universe. Ishvara not only creates, but also protects and in due course destroys the world, but only to create it again. The guiding factor in the whole process is the past karma of the beings that are to play their part on the stage of the world in the particular kalpa. A special point about Ishvara as understood here is that his existence is also established through inference and not through the Vedas. Okay? So Vatsyayana writes, Guna Vishishtam Atmantaram Ishvaraha. Ishvara is a type of Atma, a special type of Atma with special qualities, Guna Vishishtam. Because there are no other categories to put him into, Tasya Atma Kalpantaram Anupattihi. Okay? Adharma Mithya Jnana Pramadahanya Dharma Jnana Samadhi Sampada Vishishtam Atmantaram Ishvaraha. He is without adharma, mithya jnana and pramada. He is with dharma, jnana and samadhi. Tasya cha dharma samadhi phalam animadyashta vidham aishwaryam. He has the eightfold power, which is the result of dharma and samadhi phalam. Okay, and it is this dharma following the bent of his will which activates the accumulated merit and demerit inherent in each soul. This is how the desire of Ishvara to create is understood in Nyaya. Nirmana prakamyam Ishvarasya veditavyam. Okay. Apta Kalpaschayam, he is Apta, just like a father to his children. So Ishvara, like a father to beings. See, the description goes on. I think we don't have that much time, so I will summarize the idea of Ishvara. The world consists of eternal and non-eternal things. The 9 dravyas, which are eternal, can neither be created nor destroyed. Composite objects, however, which are formed from 4 kinds of atoms, are created and destroyed. So the atomic theory of Nyaya Vaisheshika, which explains the creation and destruction of the world, is applicable only to the composite objects of the world, which are non-eternal. So there is work for 3 entities in the creation of the world: Ishvara, atoms, and Adrishta. Adrishta is the karma phala, okay, the stock of merit and demerit of each individual self. So it may be noted in this connection that although Vaisheshika in the earlier stage of an independent system did not feel the need for Ishvara as the explanation of the world, the followers of Kanada made it theistic, maybe because of the influence of Nyaya. So in the Nyaya Vaisheshika system, God, Ishvara, is the efficient cause, the nimitta karana, while atoms of earth, water, fire, and air are the material cause, the upadana karana. And Adrishta, which serves as the guiding principle for Ishvara. This can be viewed as Sahakari Karana, as an auxiliary cause. All the composite objects of the world are a result of combination of the 4 kinds of atoms. The combination of 2 atoms gives rise to a Dvyanuka, dead, and the combination of 3 will give rise to a triad, a Trianuka. This Trianuka is the minimum perceptible object in the system of Nyaya Vaisheshika. How does the combination of atoms take place initially? The Nyaya Vaisheshika system answers this question by bringing in the role of Ishvara as the efficient cause. Okay, so neither the material atoms or the law of karma can act by themselves. It is Ishvara who is responsible for the initial motion of the atoms and the functioning of the law of karma. So Ishvara is not only the creator of the world, but also its moral governor, the dispenser of justice in the Nyaya Vaisheshika system. So this is how Nyaya and Vaisheshika has understood Ishvara. Of course, this is but one model that is proposed in the Indian system. And like I said earlier, there must be at least 50 different schools of thought in our tradition, 50 different models. I won't be able to dwell into the other systems today. I will carry that forward. And best summed up by T.D. Gundappa, where he says, Nuraru mata vihudu lokad granadali, ಆರಿಸಿಕೊ ನಿನ್ನ ರುಚಿಗೊಪ್ಪುವುದನದರೊಳು ಸಾರದ ಅಡುಗೆಯ ಮಾಡು ಒಳ ವಿಚಾರದೊಳೆಯಲಿ ಬೇರೆ ಮತಿ ಬೇರೆ ಮತ ಮಂಕುತಿಮ್ಮ, which is just means that there are so many options that are available. See what is most convincing to you. Whatever is the most convincing, that's that. The rest doesn't matter. So this is Nyaya Vaisheshika. I'll wrap up for today. If there's any questions, if I know the answer, I will try to answer them.
Thank you, Manjushree. It was a wonderful and very enlightening session for all of us. I will see viewers. Now is the time to leave your questions in question and answer box. I think we have 2 or 3 questions. One of the question is, will it be right to infer that Advaita school is more aligned to Nyaya Vaisheshika philosophy than Advaita school?
Yes, I guess you could say that, because this is dualist in a sense that they do take the world as a real and self also as real. So I guess you could say that Advaita is more closer to Nyaya Vaisheshika.
Another question is, can you suggest a seminal paper or article from a modern scholar which critically analyzes Advaita and Advaita from a epistemological and ontological aspects?
Most papers do that. I mean, there's no, but I will try to share a couple of papers with you when I do talk about Advaita in particular. But I mean, this is how it is analyzed. No, both epistemology and ontology has generally been, this is how any academic paper will discuss Advaita. So I don't know exactly what you mean, if there's any particular thing. For Advaita Vedanta, I will share a couple of things when I do discuss Advaita Vedanta. But if there's anything specific about Nyaya Vaisheshika, I'd like to.
And another question is, can you suggest a book to understand the basics of the Shad Darshanas, which gives an overview of Indian philosophy?
See, I basically go only for the primary sources. So it would be best if you're acquainted with Sanskrit and you can go for any of the doxographies that are available. But secondary sources, Shad Darshana, Andrew Nicholson has done a good work on this. There's Karl Potter's encyclopedia. There's Mattilal's description of all the philosophies. Professor M. Hiriyanna's Outlines of Indian Philosophy, Essentials of Indian Philosophy, all of that are very useful. Yes, that should form a good enough basic understanding of the sixth darshana. That should be good enough.
And what distinguishes Nyaya Vaisheshika realism from Mimamsa realism, both being a realistic philosophies?
No, there is a lot of what is different between the two schools. The whole outlook is different. See, Purva Mimamsa does not set out to discuss what the world is, etc. That is not the primary function that it sets out. In the very first Jaimini Sutras, he says, Athato Dharma Jignasa. So he's going, what is Dharma? See, in Purva Mimamsa, Dharma refers to Yajna. Okay? So they are more interested in understanding what the Vedas say. It is more a commentary on the Vedas and interpretation of the Vedas, not setting out as a system of philosophy on its own. So it is different. When I talk about Purva Mimamsa, I'll be able to elaborate on this in better detail. The comparison between the different systems will be better after the entire session, I think, because you will need a little bit of background to understand that, is what I feel.
One more question we have is, can you comment upon or talk upon modern interpreters of texts like Swami Vivekananda, Aurobindo, Radhakrishnan, who kind of have a more balanced approach to scripture?
Personally speaking, I don't find Professor Radhakrishnan's work very reliable. See, you must remember that the time factor plays an important role. His was also one of the first works that came out. From then, there has been a lot of research that has been made and a lot of progress in understanding these systems. A lot of manuscripts have become available over a period of time. So, although I realize that his work is what is given as the standard textbook in most of the courses, but it's not very reliable, is what I feel. Swami Vivekananda's works, again, if you're not, it's not, I don't know what you're interested in. That's the fundamental thing. If you're interested in understanding the Shastra as it is, I wouldn't rely on even Swami Vivekananda's works or Aurobindo's works. These are popular works in a sense that they're more generalized, they're for a more general audience. So if you're, if this is the first exposure to it, then that's a wonderful place to start. But otherwise, they wouldn't be very satisfactory. Sort of that's where I come from. That's all.
I think we have a few more questions. One is, can it be said that the Nyaya concern for rebirth of the same self is a parallel or can be compared with Plato's concern for self?
I'm not very familiar with Plato's idea of. I don't think I can comment on either of.
I think one question somebody is asking is, what are the 5 questions in Indian philosophy? I think you mentioned this in the beginning. So he just wants you to repeat that 5.
Okay. Just the fact that it demands that description of what the self is. How do you understand self? What is your idea about the world? As in, what is the nature of the Jagat? Then Ishvara, God. Do you accept or not accept? If you do accept, then what is the nature of God? what is the cause of suffering? Because that there is suffering is a given in all of the systems. So what is the cause of suffering? Bandha. And ultimately, how to get out of suffering. This is something that is standard. Even this is the fundamental question that plagued Buddha. It is fundamental in Christianity. So I mean, this is a very fundamental question. What is suffering? How to get out of suffering?
I think we'll take two more questions. One is after gaining knowledge of all these various darshanas, does it leave us in better conviction or does it leave us in more confusion, especially in the context of Atma and Ishvara and our spiritual pursuit? What do you think?
This is a question that I had personally for a very long time, in a sense that, yes, this is good enough for information. I mean, take all of this at information level only, just for you to get an idea of, what the Indian tradition was made up of, that there was so many ideas different from each other. But ultimately, you just have to find what is most convincing for you and stick to that, and not worry about whether it's not worry too much about whether it is the ultimate path or not. If it's convincing for you, I think that's good enough, and you shouldn't bother about the others at all. But it is a valid question. I mean, it plagued me for a very long time.
The last question, it is not directly related to the topic, but why does the maximum scholarship on Indian philosophy comes from abroad? Oxford, Bloomsbury Research, and all those things they publish Indian philosophy books by contribution from universities abroad and not Indian universities. Please comment.
Honestly, I think, see, the scholarship in Sanskrit is excellent. There's absolutely no parallel between the Sanskrit traditional scholars with the Western academicians. There's absolutely no comparison. Unfortunately, the traditional scholars are not able to put their works in a language that everybody is popularly understood by everybody else. This is the problem. There's no dearth exactly of scholarship. It's only in, well, the English language that has become the biggest barrier. People who have studied the Shastra through the English language without going to the original sources, without having been trained traditionally, that scholarship is not very rigorous, to be honest. That's to be blamed on the education system, where you're just passing the exam. So the rigor is not there in modern universities, but traditional scholarship is not compromised. Unfortunately, they're not able to express themselves or write in English. So that's probably why we feel there is a lack of Indian scholarship, but the language to be blamed, what can you do?
Thank you, Manjushree. And we all look forward to tomorrow's session, wherein you will be speaking on Vedanta and Mimamsa. So it was a wonderful session again. Thank you for coming on our platform. Viewers, don't miss tomorrow's session, same time, 10:30 a.m. Please join. Thank you. Shri Gurubhyo Namaha.